In the Times, the EU demands billions as the price of Starmer's reset, as it's called, with Brussels.
Do you remember the Brexit referendum and the promises on the side of a bus that Brexit would save us £350 million a week, which would go to the NHS, which materialised on the day of a yes vote, a marginal yes vote for Brexit? It materialised with Nigel Farage on national television conceding that actually it wasn't true and that we wouldn't really get £350 million a week back for the NHS.
£1 million a week we send to the EU, which we will no longer send to the EU. Can you guarantee that's going to go to the NHS?
No, I can't, and I would never have made that claim. That was one of the mistakes I think that the Leave campaign made.
Hang on a moment, that was one of your adverts.
Well, it wasn't one of my adverts, I can assure you.
Well, that was one of the Leave campaign's adverts. That money was going to go to the NHS.
And I think they made a mistake.
That's why people...
We have a £10 billion a year, a £34 million a day featherbed. That is going to be free money that we can spend on the NHS, on schools, or whatever it is.
And now fast forward nearly 10 years. Here we are with living with the reality that Brexit is costing us a fortune. First things first, if they told people in the vote that we would have to pay billions to leave, I don't think people would have voted Brexit. Do you? We have to date paid billions to leave the EU. That has in turn blown a massive black hole in our economy and caused all sorts of problems. We've also lost many of our rights and freedoms to live, work and retire and study across the European nations, and we have become much more closed off as a result. Now, fast forward to a Labour government trying to make Brexit work and a promised Brexit reset, which is stalling because, of course, the European Union insists that if we want to play in the European project, we have to pay. And so there is a big row taking place, negotiations. The EU is demanding money, and of course the UK, as usual, is being difficult about paying. But we can't afford to be difficult about paying because we're desperate for the access of free trade for our economy. And I'll just remind you that we paid for the pleasure of now being held in this awful position of desperation. We paid the EU billions of pounds to leave, and we have weakened ourselves, and now we're negotiating a price to pay more money to get less back than we ever had before. We lost hundreds of billions of pounds in GDP. Brexit has already cost the UK economy between 40 and 100 billion a year in GDP loss. 30 billion a year in lower tax revenue, a permanent 4% shrinkage according to the OBR. We traded down 15% compared to staying in the EU. We are literally poorer every single year because of the sovereignty fantasy. And now we're going to have to pay billions to get back less than we had before. We are about to pay Norway-style access fees for not even Norway-style access. It's like selling your house at a loss, paying the buyer compensation, moving into a tent, and then renting the shed behind your old house at triple the price. This is the single most explosive political message for the British public. We pay billions to leave. Brexit is costing us billions every year, and now we're going to have to pay billions to get back 10% of what we had for free. It's the biggest financial scam in modern British history. This is the Brexit reality. And on Politics Live, this was discussed, and the Reform spokesperson was there, of course, saying the usual nonsense about how we're doing fine out of the EU, despite the fact that every international and national economic study has shown that Brexit has been absolutely devastating. The Bank of England, even the Chancellor and the Prime Minister now have explained how damaging Brexit has been for our economy. But nobody's levelled with the country and said, guys, you paid a fortune to leave, and now we've actually realised that Project Fear wasn't fearful enough. It's worse than the Remainers said, and we're so desperate that having paid to leave, we are now going to have to pay to actually try and get a little bit of access back. You couldn't make it.
Because talks about an EU-UK reset are underway. They've continued this week. And let's have a look at this headline in The Times. The EU demands billions as the price of Starmer's reset, as it's called, with Brussels. British officials are trying to fend off, apparently, a surprise pay-to-play request that threatens to derail the talks. What's going on here? Do you think they're really surprised that the EU's wanting money in return for access?
I mean, what strikes me, and this is a part about which is a really crucial part of the reset, which is trying to enter this EU-wide defence scheme, which could be incredibly lucrative for British
about bidding for
companies. Bidding for contracts. Yeah. It was a really key part of what Keir Starmer wanted to achieve with the EU reset. I think there's always been a sense that there will need to be a certain degree of us paying in. I think the 6.5 billion, I think that's the right figure, has come as a bit of a surprise. Lots of people in government who I had a quick chat with this morning seem to think it's a bit like an opening offer. But some slightly surprised the EU is playing this hardball, but we've all lived through the Brexit negotiations. We know that this is how it works. I don't think there's any chance of Keir Starmer abandoning the possibility of us entering this scheme because, it's if as he says, the main objective of this government is growth. This is a pretty key to unlocking it.
So, Tim, is it, pay a bit of money up front to get some lucrative defence contracts?
Well, look, a few months ago, it seemed to be recognised across Europe that we were a continent that couldn't defend itself. And it was also recognised at the same time Britain doesn't spend enough on defence, but Britain and France are the two strong military powers in Europe. And now, yes, there are lucrative contracts that that Britain could possibly gain from being part of this partnership, but also Europe needs the British military. And part of the problem, I think, with this negotiations is NATO, which nearly all the same, countries are part of, wants full British involvement. And then when the discussion falls with the same people but under the EU hat, suddenly we have to pay to play. And sort of my request to our European friends really is actually the defence of our continent the absolute number one priority because of what Russia's doing in Ukraine? Or is it actually getting a few more £100 million out of the British taxpayer? Is that really your priority? And people talk a lot about continent-wide solidarity. Well, I'd like to see a little bit about it because this is about the defence issue. If it was about other things, fair enough. But if it's about Europe's defence, I think a little bit more flexibility from Europe would be welcome.
Joanna, should we pay to play?
So these are negotiations that are playing out. We don't know what's going to be decided.
Yeah, but in principle, should we be paying?
Well, of course the EU will enter those
negotiations.
Of course the EU will enter those negotiations seeking to protect its position. Of course it will, because these are a set of negotiations. I was a trade union negotiator before I entered Parliament, and, you never comment on the process of negotiations whilst they're underway, because very often what you get at the end is very different to what is discussed in the middle. What I would say is the Brexit deal that the Tories voted was not in the best interests of this country. So we are seeking to build closer trading relations with our EU partners, and that is a process of negotiations, and I think it's quite right that those negotiations play out.
The defence is one part of it, but there's also talk of trying to end the border checks on food shipments, for example. Should we pay for that? Should we pay to get rid of the friction that there is in trade?
Well, I'm not Nick Thomas Simmons, so thankfully he's heading up those
he might
negotiations.
You might want some advice.
But I think he's very capable, actually. I think in terms of food, we've seen major retailers like Asda and M&S being very clear that the EU trade deal would mean that people were paying less at the shops for their groceries than we would otherwise have had. So, as I say, the negotiations will play out and we'll see what comes at the end of those. So it's not going to be helpful just to speculate
what would
on
Reform
every
UK
twist
do
and turn of
at
that.
this point?
Well, first of all, I hope whoever's doing our negotiations isn't the same people who did negotiations with France over the one-in, one-out deal, which has turned out to be
Which we
an
only
absolute
needed because of
disaster.
Brexit.
And I also think it's where another area where Labour are going to get in trouble with trust is they didn't really talk about this in the election, and now they're opening a whole can of worms. And people are not necessarily completely satisfied with the Brexit deal. It wasn't something I was completely satisfied with what we arranged. But I think you need to let an arrangement settle for a little while. So my answer to your question, Vicky, is I would not be approaching these issues at the moment because there's plenty of other things to deal with. And the talk of basically...
Well, even though it could improve, we talked about growth, the economy. I'm
Well,
not suggesting it could improve that.
If it was done at a cost that was reasonable, I would understand it. But the record is, just as we've begun this discussion with, when we talk to the EU, it's always for them about money. And they want so much money that the benefits, which I accept are real, are overwhelmed by the amount of money or whatever they want in
But
return.
you would pay, so you'd pay something, but not too much. Switzerland pays, other countries, third countries do pay.
Well,
for
that was the
access.
nature, of partly the Brexit arrangement that we did. I understand the pay for play and negotiation, but at the moment, the EU is actually quite a broken institution at the moment. It can't agree on almost anything, and it's also struggling financially very much. So when Brussels see Britain, their eyes flash with pounds and euro signs, and we just have a bad record at getting deals.
But actually,
the British economy is
Well,
growing
actually, we've
as
just got
strongly
free
as
trade
European
deals.
countries.
Joanna?
We've just secured 3 international trade deals, so that we're not that bad at securing
Well,
deals
you're good
internationally.
You're good at securing
and delivering
deals.
jobs. And delivering jobs.
Whether they're any good is a whole other question. I don't have confidence in Keir Starmer's ability to negotiate. And
Yeah, but you want your cake and eat it. So you want all the benefits of being in the EU without being in the EU, and then say that the EU shouldn't charge us anything for any trade benefits.
I did not say that.
I mean, it's not serious.
I said I'd like
It's
a
not
good deal.
serious.
I said I'd like a good deal.
Okay. Jess, do you think that Keir Starmer is in any way concerned? Obviously, he was seen as a person who was very much against Brexit. Are they concerned about the politics of this, of looking to, get a better deal, but doesn't make him look too close to the EU? I mean, the polling actually suggests that, according to YouGov, most Britons want to see the UK return to the EU. It's 56%, so it's not, hugely overwhelming. But do you think there's some concern in Downing Street about it?
I think it's almost, there was, and now it's almost the opposite. So in the run-up to the EU reset, I think there was an incredible amount of anxiety about how it would land, whether, we would go back to those days of every kind of minutiae of trade deals being poured over and any sort of comment from Bill Cash, whoever it was, leading the front page of the Daily Mail. This has landed with barely a whisper. I think there was one critical front page on the front of the Sun which had a kipper on it about the fishing deal. Almost nothing else has borne any comment. If you talk to anyone in the city, in big business, and you ask them what are the number one barriers to growth, they will say Brexit. They will say it without, even pausing. Yeah. And so if the prize is very real here, but the political cost was seen as being too much. Now I think they think maybe the political cost isn't as much as it was.
Okay, Joanna, so why not just rejoin?
Well, because there was a democratic decision made, and actually what we are now trying to do is build a trading relationship which has grown up, which recognises some of the negatives that we experienced as a result of Brexit. So exports went down 21% as a result of Brexit.
They're up overall now,
21%
and we can't have freedom,
drop.
for example, on AI industry, which is one of the biggest future industries, if we were subject to the EU nature of regulation.
Do you think the British people want to rejoin?
I think if it actually became a hard decision, no. And Britain has grown as quickly as other European countries since we left Brexit. So, yes, there are some economic downsides. Overall, we're doing fine.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below. And if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing.